Well, good evening, family. If you will, open up your Bibles with me to the book of Daniel, chapter 11, as we continue with the fourth and final vision that the Lord gave to Daniel. You'll recall there were three previous visions that Daniel had received. The book of Daniel, as we've discussed, divided into two key sections. The first six chapters dealt with the history of Daniel. The last six chapters we've been in deal with the prophecies of Daniel. The first one was in Daniel chapter 7, where he received the prophecy of the four beasts, the vision of the four beasts. The second vision that he received was in chapter 8. That was the one of the ram and the goat. That one we talked about was completely fulfilled in that it dealt with the Grecian and the Medo-Persian empires. And then in Daniel chapter 9, he had that incredible prophecy, that 70-week prophecy that we dealt with as Daniel had prayed at the end of the captivity, wondering what was going to happen next for the people of Israel. And then finally, last week we picked up in chapter 10 with this final vision that was coming to Daniel from the Lord. And we read that Daniel was quite distressed, if you recall from last week. And the distress most likely came from the fact that Zerubbabel and Joshua had gone back to rebuild the temple, but as of yet they had not been successful there in Jerusalem to restore the worship of God. And as the month of Nisan was coming around, the first month in the Jewish calendar, the month of Passover, Daniel was grieved, and he began to fast and pray for 3 weeks, wondering what was to take place with the temple and what was to happen to the people of God. And we're told that an angel arrived, but actually informed him that he'd been sent the moment Daniel had started to pray. So for 3 weeks, the angel had been restrained. And we got a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at the warfare, the battle, the powers that be that take place behind the actual actions of what we see in our everyday lives. As this angel strove to get to Daniel, but was restrained by the prince of Persia, no doubt a demonic, some kind of a supernatural force that was restraining Daniel from getting the message of God. Now, the angel finally did get through when the archangel Michael came and helped out the other angel to free him up to get the message to Daniel. And the message that Daniel received is what we're going to begin looking at this evening, and it is unquestionably one of the most extraordinary prophecies because of its incredible detail that's given in all of the Old Testament. Whereas Daniel chapter 9 was incredible because of its foundation. It was actually very short, just 4 simple verses, but it's a foundation for much of the book of Revelation and the prophecies of the New Testament. This chapter is just a detailed history given to Daniel in advance. In fact, we titled the message, History in Advance. With that being said, let's pick up our study in Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. Now, I will say before we get into our passage that the text before us this evening is divided into two rather neat sections. The first section in verses 1 through 35 deal with the history from Alexander the Great all the way through to Antiochus Epiphanes. And so we'll be looking at the history that took place there with the Grecian Empire, the fall of the Medo-Persian and the Grecian Empire. That's the first 35 verses in incredible detail and accuracy. You'll see what I mean in a moment as we get into it. But the second portion of the chapter, from verse 36 on through the end, deal with something very different. It's no longer a fulfilled portion of history. It jumps several thousand years to a foretelling of a future event with the rise of the man of sin, that man of perdition, the Antichrist. So 2 sections, the first 35 verses deal with the history of the Grecian Empire, and then the last set of verses is going to detail the rise of the Antichrist. So let's jump into our text. Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 1. Now, then I will reveal the truth to you. 3 more Persian kings will reign, to be succeeded by a fourth, far richer than the others. He will use his wealth to stir up everyone to fight against the kingdoms of Greece. Then a mighty king will rise to power, who will rule with great authority and accomplish everything he sets out to do. But at the height of his power, his kingdom will be broken apart and divided into 4 parts. It will not be ruled by the king's descendants, nor will the kingdom hold the authority it once had, for his empire will be uprooted and given to others. And now stop right there, because the first thing you're going to notice is we kind of jump right into the text. I'm like immediately just are thrown into the story. Because Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12 are one vision, one kind of story that's unfolding, one prophecy that is given to Daniel by the angel who came to him in Daniel chapter 10. And so having concluded the story of how he got to Daniel last week, we pick right up now in the prophecy that he came to deliver to Daniel from the Lord. And that's where 11 kicks off, immediately jumping into really the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire. In fact, we're told that there will be 4 more kings who will rule over the Medo-Persian Empire. 4 more prominent kings. That's not a complete list, by the way. There were more than that kings left because, as you'll recall, this prophecy was given to Daniel in the 3rd year of Cyrus, who was the first king of the Medo-Persian Empire. So this is very early on in the Medo-Persian Empire. Babylon has just fallen. Medo-Persia has just come to power. And here Daniel now gets this prophecy saying, hey, there's only going to be 4 more kings in this existing Medo-Persian Empire before it finally collapses. And we know these prominent kings, by the way, and who they're going to be because they're actually given to us biblically as well. The first one is named Cambyses. That's from Ezra chapter 4, verse 6. He's often called Artaxerxes. That's the biblical name, but historically it would be Cambyses. The second of the Medo-Persian kings will be a guy named False Smerdes the Magian. I'm not making this up. This is actually the name of a king. I don't know what he did wrong to get that name, but that's the name that was given to him. He's noted, by the way, in Ezra chapter 4, verse 7, again, Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is just a generic name. The historical name for him was actually False Smerdes the Magian. The third of these major kings that would rise to power in the Medo-Persian Empire would be a king named Darius the First. Again, don't be confused. This is not the Darius from Daniel chapter 9. That was a governor over Babylon. This is King Darius over the Medo-Persian Empire. He was the 3rd major king to rule. We read about him, by the way, in Haggai 1:1 and in Ezra 4:24. So there's biblical references to him, actually calling him Darius, by the way. The biblical name is the same as the historical there. And then the 4th and final king that would rise to power is going to be actually Xerxes. Now the Bible calls him Artaxerxes or Ahasuerus. And we read about him in the book of Esther. He's the key one, this 4th and final major king of the Medo-Persian Empire, because it was during his reign really where the Medo-Persian Empire began to fall and collapse. What took place is that this Xerxes thought it would be good to mount a massive army, several 100,000 men, to launch a war. It was about 480 BC against an upstart group of rebels in what was to become Greece. So Greece at this point wasn't a world power, wasn't yet entering onto the world stage as a major force, but it was beginning to show some potential. And so Xerxes says, I want to go in and squish it. I want to squash this Grecian threat. And he brings this massive army against him. Quite famously, one of the battles was the 300 Spartan. Some of you may be familiar with that historical reference. I don't recommend seeing the movie. It is a movie out there about it. There's an older one that might be a little better. The newer one I don't think is probably the wisest thing to watch. But needless to say, the history is phenomenal, where 300 Grecian soldiers managed to hold back several 100,000 Medo-Persian soldiers. That was Xerxes. That was this final 4th king. And ultimately, they did end up losing to Greece. Greece kind of splintered the power of the Medo-Persian Empire. And shortly thereafter, a new king rose up who was Alexander the Great. This is the mighty king who Daniel was told will do according to his will. He's ultimately the one who takes power and authority and overwhelms, finally reduces the might of the Medo-Persians, and now you enter into this Grecian authority. Now, interestingly, in this prophecy, notice it goes on, and it says, but Alexander would be broken, this king would be broken, and divided to the 4 winds. This is very similar, by the way, to the prophecies we read about in Daniel chapter 8, if you recall, just a couple of weeks back, when we dealt with the fact that there was a ram with 2 horns representing the Medo-Persian Empire, and a goat came rushing at it with a single horn. That was Alexander the Great in Greece. And the goat was able to overwhelm the ram, but at the height of his power, the goat's horn was broken off. That was the death of Alexander, and it splintered into 4 smaller horns. The exact same history is being given to us here, but interestingly, without any kind of analogy or picture or any kind of an illustrative view. You're not talking about goats or rams. It's plainly being said, no, this is a king who's going to rise to power. He's going to be cut off at the peak of his authority, the peak of his might, and his kingdom will be divided to the 4 winds, 4 generals, 4 soldiers who would take the authority that Alexander had. Now, we know from history who these soldiers were. Greece to the west went to Cassander. Asia Minor to the east went to Lysimachus. Egypt to the south went to Ptolemy. And Babylon to the north went to Seleucus. These four generals of Alexander the Great became the lesser powers of the Grecian Empire, not as mighty as Alexander because the kingdom wasn't united. As Daniel was told, the history was fragmented, the history was scattered. Now, what's interesting is Daniel's given the insight. Notice here in verse 4, quite interesting, that the empire is not given to the posterity of this great king, referring to Alexander. Meaning, the sons of Alexander weren't going to inherit the throne or the authority of his father. It was instead going to pass to his generals. Now, what's interesting is because the sons of Alexander, he did have them, were murdered so they could not get the power. They were executed so they were not able to take the authority. That's how the generals were able to come into this power. Now, what's phenomenal, this is a bit of an introduction, and buckle your seatbelt. I apologize if I'm going to give you a lot of information tonight. I'll have a resource for you at the end, by the way, that will help kind of retain all of this because there's a lot coming. Amazingly, this prophecy, which we're 4 verses into right now, was given in 539 BC. The events that it is talking about occurred in 323 BC. That's when Alexander fell, that's when Alexander died, and his sons were murdered, and the 4 generals came to power and formed a new Grecian alliance that was weaker than the authority that Alexander had. It was a splintered nation. That's about 200 years before it happened, and in absolute clarity and detail. There's no question in regards to what's being talked about. There is no illustrative language. It's plainly saying who will rise, when it will happen, how many kings will take place in the Medo-Persian before. There's a king that rises in Greece. He won't last very long, and his kingdom will be divided to his 4 generals because his sons won't get the kingdom 200 years in advance. Now stop and ponder that for just a moment. If we're honest, prophecy fascinates us. And not just us, by the way, it fascinates people everywhere. Because we as humans, we as men, cannot see beyond the moment. We have no idea what's going to take place an hour from now, a day from now, a week, a month, a year from now. We have perfect hindsight in 2020, but we have no ability to see forward. And so for someone to be able to foretell the future is an incredible knack. It's an incredible ability. It's an incredible gift. In fact, there are people out there who have claimed to have this. One of the most famous is probably Nostradamus. He had his 1,000 quatrains that were, of course, predicting events in the future that people talk about all the time. But the reality is you get a guy like Nostradamus, and the vast majority of his prophecies did not come true. And even the ones that people say did come true are so generic, they're so loosely worded, that you can kind of read into them whatever happened to happen in history. That is not what we're seeing unfold before us here in Daniel chapter 11 in this prophecy. It is not general. It is not inaccurate. And the opposite of that, it is this incredibly detailed account, almost truly like you're reading a history book. In fact, I unfortunately have to tell you that tonight probably in many ways will sound much like a history lesson. You're going to be getting the history lesson of the Grecian Empire. We're going to be talking about kings and dynasties and marriages and betrayals. But the amazing thing is we're talking about history that was written 200 years before it happened in just absolute clarity, detail, and integrity. And that is uniquely something that only the Bible can do. This wasn't Daniel's gift, by the way. This wasn't Daniel's talent. Daniel wasn't able to do this. This is speaking of a divine intervention, an angel who came and delivered to Daniel an incredible truth, the unfolding of history in advance so that Daniel would know what would happen to his people, the children of Israel. And the only one who can do that is God, because Isaiah chapter 46 verse 10 says is that he is alone the one who can tell the end from the beginning. He alone sees the future. God does not have the restriction of man. He can see tomorrow, next month, next year, 1,000 years, to the very end of time. God has that in his scope and his sight, and he can reveal it to whom he chooses. And here he reveals it to Daniel. And that ought to bless our hearts, by the way. Because what that means is that the one we serve is the one who is in total sovereign control of all things, and the one who will make sure that what comes to pass is exactly what he intended. You know, we are in a bit of a topsy-turvy world at the moment. Economies fluctuating, people nervous and rather shaken by all of the scare with what's taking place with the virus that's going around. Nothing certain. Tomorrow's an unknown. And it can lead us to be very trepidatious, very concerned, very unsettled. But it doesn't have to, because we know the one who saw tomorrow. We know the one who formed the planets, and the day he did, he saw how they would end. And we know that he is sovereign in control and in the one steering all the events of mankind to his predetermined end. This is what this passage, this prophecy, this incredible story that Daniel's given helps give us confidence about. Well, let's move on. Verses 5 through 20, as we deal with the second aspect of this prophecy, we've seen the rise of Alexander the Great and ultimately the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire. But with the death of Alexander, we move into a second period of history, which is the kings of the north and the south. Let's pick up our reading in Daniel chapter 5. We'll read down to verse 20. The king of the south will increase in power, but one of his own officials will become more powerful than he and will rule his kingdom with great strength. Some years later, an alliance will be formed between the king of the north and the king of the south. The daughter of the king of the south will be given in marriage to the king of the north to secure the alliance, but she will lose her influence over him, and so will her father. She will be abandoned along with her supporters. But when one of her relatives becomes the king of the south, he will raise an army and enter the fortress of the king of the north and defeat him. When he returns to Egypt, he will carry back the idols with him, along with the priceless articles of gold and silver. For some years afterwards, he will leave the king of the north alone. Later, the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but soon will return to his own land. However, the sons of the king of the north will assemble a mighty army and will advance like a flood and carry the battle as far as the enemy's fortress. Then in a rage, the king of the south will rally against the vast forces assembled by the king of the north and will defeat them. After the enemy army is swept away, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will execute many thousands of his enemies, but his success will be short-lived. A few years later, the king of the north will return with a fully equipped army far greater than before. At that time, there will be a general uprising against the king of the south. Violent men among your own people will join them in fulfillment of the vision, but they will not succeed. Then the king of the north will come and lay siege to the fortified city and capture it. The best troops of the south will not be able to stand in or face the onslaught. The king of the north will march onward unopposed. None will be able to stop him. He will pause in the glorious land of Israel, intent on destroying it. He will make plans to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will form an alliance with the king of the south. He will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the king from within, but his plan will fail. After this, he will turn his attention to the coastland and conquer many cities, but a commander from another land will put an end to his insolence and cause him to retreat in shame. He will take refuge in his own fortress, but he will stumble and fall and not be seen again. His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor, but after a very brief reign he will die, though not from anger or in battle. So we pick up, and I know there's a whole lot of history going on there. You're going, man, there's a whole lot of people and names, but without any specifics. It said king of the north, king of the south, marriage here, battle there, but without any specific events, times, or names correlated to it. But here's what takes place. We can, through the lens of history, now lay over this what actually happened as the kingdom of Greece divided to the four winds, and the north and the south began to battle one another for control and dominance over the Middle East. Beginning in verse 5, you have the rise of these two prominent generals, Ptolemy and Seleucus. Now, we're told that an angel, the angel of the Lord here, laid out the struggle between these two kings. Now, in the south, Egypt, you had Ptolemy. He was at first the stronger of the two forces. In the north, in Syria, you had this general Seleucus. He was, by the way, the description here given of him is the prince that shall come, or the prince of Ptolemy. There are two generals who served alongside one another, but now they're ruling and reigning over two very different kingdoms. And Seleucus the first began to conquer about 312 down to about 300 BC. And he went as far as Asia Minor and got into India, and he became very powerful, more powerful than Ptolemy down in Egypt. So he had power over him, as you see in verse 5. So there was kind of a shift in power when they first began to rule. First, Ptolemy was stronger in the south. Then Seleucus in the north began to conquer territories, gained authority, money, resources, and the power balance shifted. And now the north, Seleucus was stronger than Ptolemy in the south. For our purposes, what's interesting, and what will become the focus of much we're going to see, is in the middle of these two battling generals, these two empires that build out of the shattered Grecian Empire of Alexander the Great, Ptolemy and Seleucus, Ptolemy south, Seleucus in the north, was the nation of Israel. It was kind of the road between these two kingdoms, the path between these two lands. And because of that, we're going to see that Israel was constantly being conquered, overrun, defeated, as these two empires fought back and forth over the next 200 or so years. Which gives us a little bit of insight, by the way. Did you ever wonder, why did God choose Israel? Of all the places on planet Earth, there are some really beautiful, nice places, by the way. There's some gorgeous islands. There's some just amazing scenery. There's some places with some astounding natural resources. Frankly, Israel has none of those. It is an itty-bitty little speck of land that is just full of a lot of rocks. It's not that pretty, certainly not that bountiful in resources. And you kind of scratch your head and go, God, why would you choose that? And by the way, Jerusalem is the rockiest and most useless of all of the places. Really, there is nothing of any value whatsoever in Jerusalem in a practical sense. Why, of everything that God could have looked at and chosen, did he choose to put his name there? Why set his stamp upon that as the Holy Land? And the answer is much what we're seeing, and we're going to note here in Daniel chapter 11. It is its geographical boundaries on how it actually separates the whole world. If you want to go from Asia to Africa, you pass through Israel. If you want to go from Africa to Europe, you pass through Israel. If you even want to go from Europe to Asia, you can pass through Israel. It is the crossroads, quite literally, of the globe, and that is not by accident. It is by purpose and intent. Is it no wonder that in the book of Acts we see that the gospel message was so quickly able to radiate out to the whole world, because the hub, the source of the gospel, was at the spokes of the world. And from there it could quickly travel out to share the message with all mankind. Israel always is in the center of all things. Let's pick up in verse 6. As we read about a marriage that goes wrong, we're told that the daughter of the king of the south will make an agreement with the king of the north. Now, the king of the south is now Ptolemy II. He's known Philadelphus, or the Ptolemy who loved his brother is all that Philadelphus means. He's the second king of the south, so he's the son of Ptolemy I, the general of Alexander. He forced his daughter Bernice to marry Antiochus II Theos, who was the second king of the northern kingdom of Seleucus. So what you have happen is an attempt to kind of make peace between these northern and southern kingdoms. Ptolemy II in the south says, hey, Antiochus II up there in the north, why don't you take my daughter Bernice as your wife? Make peace between our two kingdoms. But there was a catch. Antiochus II was already married. So in order to marry Bernice, he had to divorce his first wife and then marry Bernice. Well, his first wife, Laodicea, didn't take well to this. She didn't think that was a great idea, which is why we're told that this marriage didn't work well. She did not retain her authority, nor did he retain his authority. The whole idea of blending the two kingdoms didn't work out, because shortly after this marriage, Ptolemy II, there in the south, died. Just older guy, kicked the bucket finally, he died off. When he died, Antiochus II up in the north, he figures, hey, there's no more reason to hold on to this marriage, so he kicks Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy II, to the curb. and says, I'm going to take my first wife back. I like Laodicea better. But Laodicea wasn't so happy about the whole arrangement. She proceeded to murder Bernice, Antiochus II, and their infant son. So it was a whole soap opera drama kind of thing. It was Days of Our Lives in the Grecian Empire some 2,500 years ago. And that's exactly what Daniel's being told. He's being given this level of detail. But we're told that from the branch of her roots, one will arise with an army and prevail against the north. So, from the same family line as Bernice, now she didn't do well. Her whole purpose for being married off to the north, that all failed. It ended up in a whole murder scandal. But from the same family line, from the branch of her roots, another king in the south rose up, and he was able to be successful in conquering the north. Now, this branch of the roots of Bernice is speaking of her brother, Ptolemy III. So Ptolemy II married off his daughter Bernice. She died, murdered. Ptolemy III, who was the brother of Bernice, rises to power. He then raises up a mighty army, and he's able to defeat Seleucus II Callimachus. I don't make these names up. I'm not kidding. Seleucus II Callimachus, or the boastful he was called, was the ruler that took over after Antiochus II was murdered. He fell in battle to Ptolemy II. He entered into the fortress of the king to the north, exactly as stated here in our prophecy, and carried off to Egypt all of their princes as well as their idols and their precious gold and silver vessels. Just take that in for a minute, because that was probably a whole lot of information. Note the detail that is given. We're talking about palace intrigue. We're talking about murder. We're talking about brothers rising up, conquering in revenge. All of it given explicitly to Daniel exactly what would take place. But it doesn't end there. Notice in verses 9 through 14 that having now seen this tug of war between these two kingdoms of the north and the south, Ptolemy and Seleucus, we're given a kind of a warning that we need to be careful whose side we choose to fall on, because it was not like one would ever get stronger than the other. For literally centuries, these two warring kingdoms would go back and forth. Let's take a peek. In verse 9, notice that the king of the north will come again to the king of the south, but he will return defeated. However, his son will stir up strife, and the king of the south will be moved with rage. So what ends up happening here is that Seleucus II, the king of the north, he decides to come down to the king of the south. He's been defeated once by Ptolemy III. He wants to come back and kind of regain all of his lost treasures that Ptolemy III took from him, but he's ultimately defeated in battle. But one of the sons of Seleucus II is raised up, and he stirs the king of the south to rage. Now, Seleucus II had several sons. There weren't just one of them historically. There was Seleucus III, Cyrenaeus, which means the thunderbolt. He died in battle, so that's not the one that stirred up strife with Ptolemy III. He also had a son named Antiochus III. Now, Antiochus III is also known as Antiochus the Great. We'll deal more with him momentarily. But Antiochus the Great mounted several campaigns against Egypt. So Antiochus is the son of Seleucus III. He ultimately kind of gains power and authority, raises up armies to kind of trouble Ptolemy III down in Egypt. But ultimately, the Egyptian army under Ptolemy IV, Philopator, the father-loving, defeats Antiochus III. And Antiochus loses his entire army, and he's almost captured himself in the desert. So you have this back and forth, this striving between the two. As one son is raised up, and he fights against, the failure of his father before him, going back and forth. Now you've got Antiochus III fighting against Ptolemy IV. But the heart of the king of the south will be lifted up, but the king of the north will come back again. So Antiochus III is ultimately defeated in battle by Ptolemy IV. But he comes back a second time with a much greater army, much greater wealth. He actually ends up conquering much of India again, as far as the Caspian Sea. And Ptolemy IV dies, and he's succeeded by his infant son Ptolemy V Epiphanes. And Antiochus III assembles an army and goes and attacks him, and this time he's able to prevail against him. And even many of the Jews support Antiochus III against Ptolemy V. Now, interesting note in our passage in verse 14 here that those Jews that are being described who support Antiochus III are described as violent, as criminals, because they're not standing for the Lord. These Jews are standing with a pagan king, one against another. Now, stop for a moment. Because I want you to see the struggle that's taking place. I don't expect you to remember all the names, which Ptolemy, which Antiochus, which Seleucus we're talking about. There's going to be a whole lot of them and a whole lot of Roman numerals after their names. They just keep counting upwards more and more. But I want you to see in this back and forth political strife of their day that some of the Jews chose to side with one over the other. Jews came in and said, well, frankly, we like Antiochus III. He's a better guy. He's more I kind of character than that Ptolemy V. So we're going to stand with the northern empire of Seleucus. We're going to reject the southern empire there in Egypt. But God describes those who stand with a pagan king as being violent and criminal. Because it's not about standing with a political government. It's about standing with God. And I chewed on this and thought about it because in our current state of politics, we kind of have a very similar situation. It turns out mankind has not changed much over the millennium. Back in the days of the prophecy, you had north against south, Ptolemy and Seleucus. Two kingdoms warring against one another. Which side do you want? Today we've got donkeys and elephants. Which particular side do you want to stand on? Which particular political party do you want to affiliate or associate with? Now, don't get me wrong. I absolutely believe we should vote. It is not only our civic duty, it is our responsibility to stand up for biblical truths. But I got to tell you guys, quite frankly, I don't know that there's a whole lot of wisdom in rallying to a particular political party. Because quite frankly, both of them are ruled and run by very flawed men. We don't stand for a political party, we stand for Jesus Christ. We don't affiliate with a particular group. We share the hope of the gospel message. We don't get caught up in the politics of the day. We point people to the word of God that is everlasting and unchanging. And that's the idea that's given here. Be careful whose side you go on. North, south, Seleucus, Ptolemy, elephants, donkeys. And we just want to stand up for the Lord. Truth. We want to stand for Jesus Christ. Well, let's move on to the fourth thing that we note here in our passage. The fourth thing we note is in verse 15 through 20, this particular king of the north, Antiochus III, also known as Antiochus the Great. I do got to put in there this disclaimer. He gave himself that name. We don't call him Antiochus the Great because he was so great. We call him Antiochus the Great because he thought he could call himself that. He liked the whole title thing that Alexander started and thought he could mimic it. It didn't fit him very well. He was not nearly the king that Alexander was. But notice in verse 15, we're told the king of the north will take a fortified city. Now, this is referring to when Antiochus III conquered the city of Sidon, resulting, by the way, in the occupation of Israel, the glorious land. So Antiochus manages to push south towards Egypt, takes the city of Sidon there in modern-day Lebanon, including on all the way down to Jerusalem and into Israel. Now, Egyptian leaders tried to rescue the besieged city of Sidon, but even their choice troops, notice there, shall have no strength. They were not successful. So Antiochus was able to throw off, preserve his siege of Sidon, and defeat the southern armies of Ptolemy. But he will give the daughter of women to destroy, but she shall not stand with him. Now, this is an interesting reference. So Antiochus III, wanting to try to make peace once again, goes back to the age-old tried tactic of marrying your daughter off to your opposing enemy. So she takes his daughter and says, let me marry her off to the king of the south. Now, his daughter's name was Cleopatra. Don't get too excited because I know that name's familiar. This is not the Cleopatra of the time of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. That was Cleopatra the 7th. This is Cleopatra the 1st. So different person, just happens to be the same name, but this is the daughter of Antiochus III. And he marries her off to Ptolemy V in 192 BC. Now, Antiochus's plan was quite simple. I'm going to marry my daughter off so that I can have influence and control in the southern kingdom. If I can't beat him fully in battle, I'll see if I can't marry him and defeat him that way. But his plan does not work. She is the destroyer of women. She's meant to go in and disassemble to destroy the power of the southern kingdom. But it fails. Antiochus fails because ultimately Cleopatra chooses to side with her husband, Ptolemy V, rather than her father, Antiochus III. And therefore, the whole kind of charade falls apart and ultimately ends in ruin. Doesn't work the way that Antiochus intended. So instead, he turns his wrath towards the coastlands. He defeated Egypt, but he tries to conquer Greece now. So he's contained Egypt. He's made marriage into the Ptolemy line failed. That didn't work as well because his daughter sided with Ptolemy over him. But he chooses to turn his direction now. He says, okay, South Egypt's relatively contained. Let me see if I can take on Greece. He is not successful. He fails to succumb and to overcome the kingdom of Greece. He turned his face towards his own land, defeated and broken. Notice there in verses 19. And he stumbled and fell, and he was seen no more. He didn't fall in battle. Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, ended up dying while he was trying to plunder a temple in the city of Elam. He was just killed, murdered, and he ceases to exist. He falls off the pages of history. His title of great's about all that was really great about him. He wasn't all that fantastic of a king. Much of what he did ended up not being very successful. But again, note the accuracy, the details. I mean, down to who's marrying who sides with who. You know, the fact that Cleopatra sided with her husband over her father, all of it detailed to Daniel hundreds of years before the events actually occurred. Well, finally, notice verse 20. That one will rise in his place. So a new king rises after the death of Antiochus III and imposes taxes. Now, this is Seleucus IV, Philopator. Now, he's the father lover. That's what Philopator means. He has to impose taxes on his kingdom because Rome now is beginning to rise as a power in the West. And Rome is beginning to force taxation. They haven't conquered the Seleucian Empire, but they're forcing heavy taxation upon them to the Roman Empire. They had to pay about 1,000 talents of gold annually. That's talent 75 pounds, so 75,000 pounds of gold. That's a whole lot of money. That needed to be paid annually, so the king, Seleucus IV, ended up taxing his empire heavily to be able to pay his debt to the Roman kingdom. But his reign was short-lived because he was putting special taxes on the Jews. Apparently didn't like them very much. And these special taxes upset the Jews quite a bit. And this king, Seleucus IV, mysteriously died, most think by poisoning, by potentially actually a Hebrew tax collector named Heliodorus. We read about that in the apocryphal books of 2 Maccabees 3:7. So a bit of an intrigue there. This king doesn't last very long. Tax too heavily, upset people. Good lesson not to tax people too heavily. They get upset, they rise up, and the king ended up dying very early in his reign. Which brings us to Antiochus Epiphanes. Any questions, by the way? Pastor Glenn, anybody questioning in? Is anybody listening in, or have I lost them all with all the details? That is the battle between the north and the south, there in verses 5 through 15. Again, crazy amounts of details. Take hope if you're curious, if you happen to be a nut of history and you find this fascinating. I will upload a document at the end that details all this information so that you can review it at your leisure. Let's pick up in verse 21 as we now see the rise of a king named Antiochus Epiphanes. As I mentioned, this first portion of the chapter began with Alexander, then was the battle between the kings of the north and south, but it concludes with the rise of a particular king in the north named Antiochus Epiphanes. Let's read Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 21. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give honor or royalty. But he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably even unto the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall dispense among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall come up, stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, and they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat the portion of his delicacy shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper, for the end of it will be at an appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart will be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For the ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return with rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. The forces shall be mustered by him. They will defile the sanctuary fortress, and then they will take away the daily sacrifices. The place there will be abomination of desolation. And those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God will be strong, and he will carry out great exploits. Those are the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days. They will fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they will be aided with a little help. But many will join them by intrigue, and some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, and to make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Now we end up in verses 21 through 35 coming to this rather prominent figure known as Antiochus Epiphanes. This, by the way, is the exact same historical character that we looked at back in Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. He is the little horn, not the Daniel chapter 7 little horn. We'll get there momentarily. He will come into picture here momentarily. But this is the little horn out of the Grecian Empire who rose up and caused the abomination of desolation there in the city of Jerusalem. But we're given a lot of information, a lot more information about him here than we got in Daniel chapter 8. First of all, we're told that he seized the throne by subtlety rather than obtaining it honorably. Now, an honorable way to obtain a throne would be by the line of succession. If my father was king, I'm the oldest son, I honorably become the next king because I am in a line of succession. That is not how Antiochus got the throne. When Seleucus IV died, he had several sons who should have been able to come to the throne. Demetrius, his first son, was being held as a prisoner in Rome. Again, Rome is at this point in history beginning to rise as a major power. And so they've captured one of the sons of Seleucus II, Demetrius. So he can't become king. He's a prisoner. The second son of Seleucus II, of fourth, was still a baby. His name was Antiochus IV. But the baby ultimately was too young to get into power, too young to be able to take the throne. So Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the brother of the king, said, let me watch after the young child. I'll take care of him. I'll be his caretaker, if you will, his overseer, his regent, until such a time as he's ready to take the throne. So they gave the young baby into the arms of his loving uncle, Antiochus Epiphanes, who proceeded to then murder him. So there was no longer any line of ascension to the throne. As there was no more sons, he, as the brother of the king, was able to seize power. So he got it by intrigue. He didn't receive the throne honorably. He essentially murdered his way into the throne. This is the kind of guy Antiochus was. But notice with the force of a flood there in verse 22, everyone was swept away before him, because Antiochus, upon receiving the throne, taking the throne, began several campaigns against Egypt in the south, against Ptolemy in the south, and he was victorious over his enemy. He managed to defeat all of the armies of Egypt. In fact, we're told that he even managed to take away the Prince of the Covenant. That's not referring to anything Judaic, by the way. History seems to suggest that the Prince of the Covenant refers to the high priest of Onias, was one of the leading priests there in Egypt, and he was also killed by Antiochus when he conquered Egypt. So that was when he took away the Prince of the Covenant. But notice verse 23. After he defeated the south, he made a league with the south to act deceitfully. So he begins to make a covenant. Hey, I've defeated you. Let's be pals and buddies now. But ultimately, his league failed. His league did not create the effect that he wanted to, because Cleopatra, who was, by the way, his sister, had two sons. Remember, she married Ptolemy V in the south, and the two sons were now battling for control. And Antiochus tries to come in and kind of favor one over the other. He favors Ptolemy VI Philometor, who loves his mother. That's what Philometor means. So Antiochus tries to come in and try to get involved with the politics of the throne of ascension there down in Egypt with his sister Cleopatra. But ultimately, he's trying to do it for his own gain, but it fails him. He acts deceitfully to try to make a league down in Egypt, but it doesn't work out for him. He does enter, notice verse 24, peacefully into the richest places. Antiochus was a greedy man, never content with what he had, constantly seeking to enlarge the borders of his kingdom. And he didn't care how he did it. If it was by military expedition, he would conquer. If it was by intrigue, he would try to influence the relationships that he had, be it with his nephews down in Egypt. But unlike his fathers before him, he used his wealth to buy favor, security, and cooperation for others. He began to distribute the funds that he had, his riches, to help him gain influence and power in new places. This had never been done. This was unique to Antiochus, at least to the extent that he was doing it. In fact, we're told in 1 Maccabees 3:30, again, Maccabees being an apocryphal or an extra-biblical book of history, we're told that he feared that he might not have such funds as he had before for his expenses and for the gifts which he used to give more lavishly than preceding kings. In other words, he didn't have enough money because he kept pouring out money to get influence to those around him. And his influence allowed him to stir up a great army against the king of the south. Notice there in verse 26. And the outcome of the battle was that the king of Egypt was defeated. He was not able to stand. So again, Antiochus comes against the south, against his nephews, and he's able to have victory over them. Notice in verses 27 through 28, though, that the heart of both of the kings were evil. Not just Antiochus in the north, but also Ptolemy in the south. These were not godly men. They struggled back and forth. They would make agreements that would not last. They would fight over power and riches and authority, but ultimately, never content, because they would never be fulfilled by the things they were getting. In fact, we're going to find out that Antiochus was most jealous of all of the Jewish people. Because as he's striving for, killing for, murdering his own nephew to get power, money, wealth, influence, none of it ever fulfilled him. None of it ever gave him contentment. And yet the Jewish people had, in their captivity, in their bondage, underneath the thumb of this horrible ruler, joy that he could never find. And he hated them for it. Because the reality is, we were not created to be satisfied by anything that this world has to offer us. It really doesn't make a difference if we try for money. I know people who have chased after money till they've lost all things that mattered, to be frank, in the pursuit of their wealth. And they're more miserable the day they ended than the day they started. Because money is never, ever enough. There's not enough money in the world to ever give us contentment, to ever give us peace, to ever fulfill us, because it was never meant to. I know people who chase after relationships. They think if I could just meet Mr. Right, Mrs. Right, my life will be complete. I'll finally have what I want. But we're not meant to be completed by another person. Marriage? Marriage was never meant to complete us. In fact, the reality is marriage is meant to challenge us. You think the life is hard living single? Get married and have the reality of someone who's a mirror that shows you who you really are 24/7. It will humble you. It will break you. I had a dear friend once tell me, if that doesn't work, God gives us kids and they finish us off. The work is absolutely going to take place. As it should, because it's not about a relationship with someone here. We were created to be fulfilled, satisfied, content by one relationship only, and that is with God in heaven. We're told in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 that God has put eternity into our hearts, and then nothing shy of a relationship with Him will ever find satisfaction for us. In fact, there's a great passage in John chapter 4 where Jesus was ministering there to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, where she, having had 5 husbands and didn't even bother marrying the 6th one, she's living with a guy, is challenged by Jesus going, hey, ask me and I'll give you living water. Because the water that she was drawing up, the water of this world, wealth, relationships, whatever it is we try to satisfy ourselves with, never can ever give us contentment. Only Jesus, only living water will ever give us the wholeness, the purpose with which we were created for. So these kings, Antiochus, and he tried hard, but there was no satisfaction in anything that he did. Well, notice in verses 29 through 31 that he returned once again to the south, once again to make war, where he'd been prosperous in previous attempts, by the way. He'd conquered several times now the kingdom of Ptolemy. But this time was not like the former times. This time was different. We're told at the appointed time, he invaded Egypt. Now, it's 168 BC is the timeline we're referring to. But the difference this time wasn't in Egypt, it was in Rome. You see, Rome was now coming into its Rome. Rome was now becoming a world power. And notice there in our text that the ships of Cyprus come. That's thought to be a reference to the Roman armadas who came in from the west and said to Antiochus, listen, Egypt is off limits. Egypt is ours. In fact, history records that they drew a circle around Antiochus and said, choose very carefully which way you step. Step to the south, you're going to deal with us. Step back north, go back home, and we'll leave you alone. And because of that, Antiochus was not able to conquer down in Egypt, and he was furious over it. In fact, he returned, according to our text, in rage against the Holy Covenant. You see, having been shorn by Rome, having been denied the prize of Egypt by the Roman authority and powers, he turned his vengeance and anger upon the people of Israel as he went back from Egypt, north through Israel, home. And as he was there in Israel, he did the impossible. He did the unthinkable. He did what never should have been done, which is he performed the abomination of desolation. This is the exact thing we read about there in Maccabees 1:44 through 54. We talked about it back when we were in Daniel chapter 8, verses 23 through 25. He went into the holiest of all there in that second rebuilt temple, the temple of Zerubbabel, the temple that had been built after they had returned from that captivity in Babylon. And he offered a pig upon an altar there to Zeus where the holiest of all was, where the Ark of the Covenant had once stood, where the mercy seat once sat. Now, this was an abomination of desolation, not the abomination, because Jesus, again, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, refers to an abomination after this event of Antiochus as a yet-to-be future event. So there will be another abomination that will one day take place. But this, in his rage, he does perform an abomination of desolation, which led to an uprising and a revolt. Notice there in verses 32 through 35. We're told that those who do wickedly against the covenant, Antiochus corrupted with flattery. So he's there in Israel. He performs the abomination of desolation. He offers the pig to Zeus. there are actually Jews who side with him, Jews who are okay with what took place, those who do wickedly, referring to Jews, against the covenant of God because they don't mind that this abomination took place, and they're okay with it because Antiochus corrupts them with flattery. And then we say, "Oh, you guys are so great. I'm so glad you're helping me out. So glad that you're on my side and that you're helping with me." So there were Jews that actually went with Antiochus. But the people who know their God shall be strong. Speaking of the Maccabean revolt, Holiest Maccabea, as he revolted against Antiochus. And the resulting conflict, many were killed. Many of the Jews died as they began a guerrilla warfare in response to this abomination of desolation against Antiochus Epiphanes. But not only did it cause great harm to the Jews physically, on the flip side, it also caused a revival there spiritually. Because while some of the Jews had been corrupted by the flattery of the king, others had been purged. It kind of became a line of demarcation. Hey, where do you stand? Are you going to stand with a pagan king who offers pigs to a false idol in our temple? Are you going to give in to fear? Are you going to stand with the politics of the day, with the morality of the moment? Or are you going to stand with God, his truth, his eternal word, what's right? And so it painted a picture. You couldn't ride a fence. You couldn't sit in a line. You had to be on one side or the other. And although Antiochus attempted to annihilate those devoted to God, he only actually succeeded in purifying the followers of God because he made them choose the Lord. Now, that struck me, by the way. We live in an era, in a time of extreme political correctness. Heaven forbid we don't tout the party line. Heaven forbid we stand up and actually say something as crazy as there are genders, 2 of them, and we're born that way. My goodness, that statement right there, you are going to incur the wrath of a generation to make such a simple statement as that. It is not allowed. It is forbidden to discuss. I mean, we're not even going to get into who you can marry or what you can marry. I mean, the day and age we're in is absolutely wild. Wrong is right, right is wrong. We as Christians are now looked at as being morally bankrupt because we don't hold to the open-mindedness of the world around us. And it makes us have to choose. Where do we stand? What do we believe? Do we give into the pressure? Do we succumb to the moral ambiguity of the society that we live in? Or do instead we stand up and say, no, we have the truth. We know who is truth. There is only one truth, and he is the way and the life, and no man comes to the Father except through him. Listen, it is a choice we all have to make. It was a choice that was made in the days of Antiochus. It was a choice the Jews, many had to give their life for. But I'll tell you what, it's a choice that no one regrets when they make it the right way. Revelation chapter 3, verse 5 tells us that he who overcomes, he who does not succumb, will be clothed in white garments, and Jesus will not blot his name out of the book of life. I got to tell you what, guys, I don't want my name blotted out of the book of life. I want to know that I'll stand one day before my Creator in heaven and can say, I did not deny you, I stood for you, and hear him say that I stand now with him. That was the choice before these Jews in the days of Antiochus. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our chapter. As we come into the second major section, it's not as long, by the way. Please don't be too intimidated. We will wrap this up rather quickly. But the second major section is we now take a turn from history to unfulfilled prophecy. Now, before we get into the passage, it's worth noting this is a bit of a controversial section. The conclusion of Daniel 11 does have different views that people carry about it. Those first 35 verses that we just went through contain 135 prophetic statements. Let me repeat that because that's pretty astounding. 35 verses had 135 prophetic statements in it, 135 facts that had not yet been fulfilled when Daniel received them that ultimately would be fulfilled in history. 135 of those, and all of them, by the way, to the T, without an exception, have been fulfilled today. All of them were in reference to the period between Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes. You can look at it, find it, read your history books. Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 through 35 is sealed and done. When you get to verse 36, it all changes. There is no major noticeable point of deviation. It actually kind of seems like the passage just keeps flowing forward. The dilemma is that now everything that's going to be talked about in these last verses has no historical point of reference. Were the previous 35 verses, 135 statements, all succinctly fulfilled, suddenly now in verse 36 to the end of the chapter, verse 45, nothing correlates to history. Nothing lines up with any historical facts. Now, there's two thoughts on this, by the way, and I'm sure you'll guess which one I fall on. Thought number one is that these last verses are still dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes. It's a continuation from verse 35. We're still dealing with the same king there in the Grecian Empire. And Daniel just gets it wrong. The details just aren't as accurate. That's wrong. That's not the Bible. Second point of view is that we change our active character. We're no longer dealing with the same individual. Although there's just one verse between 35 and 36, you're actually dealing with a 2,000-year gap. You're no longer talking about the Grecian Empire. You're no longer talking about the little horn of Daniel chapter 8. You're now talking about the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. This is now taking in sight the Antichrist, the man of sin. This is dealing with the book of Revelation, chapter 6 through 19. The great tribulation is now in sight. We enter into chapter 11, verse 36, and we've now changed course, and we're dealing with unfulfilled prophecy. Let's pick up. Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 36. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a god of fortress, a god which his fathers did not know. He shall honor the God of gold and silver with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortress with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. He shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. At the time of the end, the king of the south will attack him, and the king of the north will also come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and many with ships. Now notice, by the way, worth taking a quick second to take a peek here, that the king we're dealing with is now being attacked by the king of the south and the king of the north. Both are attacking this new king that we're referencing here, this power, this mighty one who's now risen up, who exalts himself against the God of gods. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. This is this new king. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries will be overthrown, but these will escape his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver. He will have over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans, the Ethiopians will fall at his heels. But news from the east and the north will trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with a great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He shall plant trees. He shall plant the tent of his palace between the seas and the glorious mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. So here in verse 36, you have this shift, this change. Insight is no longer this rather petty king of this Grecian empire, Antiochus Epiphanes. Instead, it is the last ruler of the rebellion against God. This is none other than the man of sin, the Antichrist, the man of perdition, the big mouth of Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. He is the one who will rise out of the revived Roman Empire. There we read about it in Daniel chapter 7, out of that sea and that final terrible beast. He will present himself as the Messiah. He will proclaim that he, by the way, is raised from the dead. Revelation chapter 13, verse 3. He will mimic the actual story of the Messiah. He will attempt to duplicate God's purpose and plan, but only for as long as God allows it, till the predetermined time is done. Stop there for a minute. How frustrating does that have to be for Satan? Can you imagine? Here you are, this foe, this nemesis of God, desiring to thwart his plans of redemption, to attempt to overthrow his people, to bring people into everlasting condemnation. Yet, despite all of your efforts, all he can do, everything that takes place, is only what is predetermined to be done. The Antichrist will rise to power. The world will go to hell in a handbasket, only for as long as God allows it, and only ultimately for the purpose that God has for it. You know, I got to tell you, in a day and a time where a lot of people are going a little crazy, with all of the things that are happening around us, man, isn't it just gratifying and hope-giving to recognize and realize that God is absolutely sovereign and in control of every bit of it. Is the world getting worse and worse? Yes. Are men planting horrible, evil things? Absolutely. Are their intentions nefarious? Unquestionably. Does it mean that God isn't in control? Absolutely not. They only have as much leash as God has predetermined to be allowed. That doesn't just talk about every ordinary man. That talks about the Antichrist and the power that is behind him and Satan. They can only do as much as our sovereign Lord permits. I love that. Well, notice the Antichrist will not worship the God of his fathers. Now this is a very interesting phrase. This is where we get some rather unique insight, and one of the few places in the Bible, by the way, where this occurs, of exactly who the Antichrist might be. The term there, God of his fathers, is a very Jewish term. In fact, the word God there is the word Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. The generic one, not the specific one, but it is still the Hebrew word for God. And it kind of gives the hint or the suggestion that the Antichrist very well may have Jewish heritage. Am I saying the Antichrist will be a Jew? There's a good chance. Can't speak emphatically. I would not say so, doctrinally, but it would seem to hint that that is the case. And it would make sense, by the way. Although the Antichrist will come out of the revived Roman Empire, it'll come out of Europe. He will rise up as the European leader. His heritage will be Jewish. And it would honestly have to be in order for the Jews to receive him as the Messiah. The Jews are not going to receive a Gentile as their promised Redeemer, their promised King. So there is a good chance, and this would seem to suggest that he will be a Jewish individual, of Jewish lineage, of Jewish heritage. But it goes on to say, nor will he have a desire for women. Okay, this is worth taking a moment to explain. There are some who have interpreted this to state that not having a desire for women suggests that the Antichrist may be homosexual. That is probably not what this means. It wouldn't quite fit the context. It doesn't quite seem to fit the purpose of the passage. It more contextually would seem to refer to the fact that he rejects the hope of the Messiah for the world. For the Messiah was meant to come through woman. That's the promise that was given back to Eve in Genesis chapter 3. The seed of the woman will smite and strike the head of the serpent. And so the whole idea is that the hope of every good Jewish girl is that maybe she be the one chosen to bring the Messiah into the world. That she would be the one that we bless to have that seed come forth that would redeem mankind, which Mary obviously was the one that was chosen. We know the story from the New Testament back in Matthew chapter 1, Luke chapter 1. We know how it plays out. But the Jewish hope, the hope of the woman in Judaism, is the redemption of the world through the seed of the promise given in Genesis chapter 3. And so the suggestion here probably is he doesn't have that same desire. He doesn't have desire to see the world redeemed by the Messiah. That's more likely the interpretation. Take it or leave it. You can run with it whichever way you choose. It is a rather controversial verse. But he will give, this king, honor to the God of fortress. Now, this speaks of the fact he will not honor the God of his fathers. Instead, he will honor the God of military might. He will put his confidence in the material, in the power of the world around him. He doesn't put his confidence in the divine, but in the physical. And that gives him this opportunity to rule over many. He becomes the predominant leader of the world for 7 years. This is an old lie, by the way. Our enemy would love for us to fall into this same trap of putting our trust into the things of this world over the things of the Lord. But then again, nothing, Satan says, is ever true. In John chapter 8, verse 44, we're told he is a murderer and a liar. And nothing that he says is true. And there is no confidence that we should put in this world because there's nothing in this world that lasts. The Antichrist, this man of sin, this man of perdition, will put his confidence in the God of fortress. And it will succeed for 7 years. But ultimately fail, notice verse 40, when the conclusion of his kingdom finds him in the battle of Armageddon. We're told at the set time, the king of the north and the south, both of them, mind you, will come against this final king, a final war with the Antichrist. But he'll overwhelm the north and the south. He's able to conquer many kingdoms. Many of the people that tried to resist his reign and rule will fall to the wayside, including Israel, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, are all named as kingdoms that fall to him. There are a few who manage to stay safe. We're told that Edom, which is modern-day Jordan, Moab, and Ammon, all of those, by the way, are there in the south part of the Dead Sea. Those are all the kingdoms that are going to be able to resist his power, probably for a good reason. According to Isaiah chapter 16, verses 1 through 5, we're told that the Jews, when they flee the persecution of this man of sin, of the Antichrist, that they will hide out in the city of Selah, which is the biblical city of Petra. I've been there. It's actually quite an incredible city, an amazing ruins. There in modern-day Jordan, about halfway up the Dead Sea. Absolutely phenomenal place to go. In fact, have you ever seen the movie Indiana Jones? I think it's The Last Crusade. That amazing building that they're coming through the canyon, that's actually the city of Petra. It's thought that that's where the Jews will find their refuge, and so those particular places will manage to stay safe from the Antichrist. In fact, we're given the same picture in Revelation chapter 12, where we're told that the people of Israel flee and find refuge from the great dragon for a season during this time of tribulation. Jesus said the same thing in Matthew chapter 24, where he told them to flee. The same idea, where they flee out to the desert so they are able to withstand and are not conquered. There's a few places, but most of them do fall. But notice verse 44. After conquering Egypt, the Antichrist will get word of a gigantic army that's coming at him, an invading force of huge proportion. Maybe the army of the east, spoken of Revelation chapter 9, verses 13 through 21. There's a lot of differing views on that one. I'm not quite sure what you think about that, a 200 million man army crossing the Euphrates River. Some say it's spiritual, some say it's a physical army. Maybe this is what got the Antichrist's attention. We don't quite know. But he will plant his tents, his palaces between the sea and Israel, the glorious mountain. This is Armageddon. This is where he plants his final tent. This is where he sets up his final battle, where he will try to resist this army coming in, but ultimately will turn to face Jesus when he rides out of heaven, Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 21. And he comes to Jesus Christ, battle the Antichrist and his armies there in the valley of Megiddo, Har Megiddo, also known as the valley of Jezreel, or the valley of Jehoshaphat. Joel chapter 3, verse 2 tells us that all of the nations will be gathered together, to be brought down in that valley of Jehoshaphat, that long valley that sits there in the central plains of Israel, where horses will flow, or the blood will flow, to the horse's bridle as Jesus rides out of heaven. And according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8, with one word of his mouth will defeat them all. He will then throw the Antichrist into the lake of fire. He will be the first inhabitant to spend eternity in a place created for Satan and his angels, according to Revelation chapter 19, verse 20. He will meet his appointed, and he will fall, and there will be none to help him. That, therefore, concludes this particular portion of the prophecy. We will go on next week and pick up in chapter 12. It is the exact same prophecy. We're still going through the same vision. As more information is going to be given, not so much like this. Daniel 11 uniquely is a great deal of history that takes us all the way from Alexander through Antiochus and then jumps to the Antichrist. Daniel chapter 12 is going to give us more what's going to happen after the return of Jesus Christ. Some phenomenal prophecy next week. But as we conclude this week, I want you to look at and really kind of sink in and saturate in this idea. Both how incredibly accurate this prophecy is, as well as how provoking it becomes when we understand that a portion of it is yet to be fulfilled in the rise of the Antichrist and this man of sin coming to power. Because the reality is it's easy for us to forget how close we are. That the days are short. You know, we, no doubt, you probably much like me, got up this morning, went for a bike ride, came home, had breakfast, came to work, tinkered with some things, website, Pastor Glenn said we're just messing around with that. Check it out if you want to. It's a work in progress, but we're messing around with some stuff, Teach a Bible study tonight. I'll go home tonight. I'll go to bed. Kiss my daughter, kiss my wife, good night, and I'll crash and go to sleep. Wake up tomorrow morning, do the same thing. And it's easy to get caught up in the monotony and forget that we're close. That what this prophecy so accurately laid out in the first 35 verses, history, is now winding up towards the conclusion. And that portion about the Antichrist is on our doorstep and about to become reality. And we want to make sure that we're living in such a way that we do not miss the opportunities in front of us. Listen, brothers, sisters, friends, let's seize the time, seize the day, redeem the time. Ephesians 5:16 tells us, for the days are evil, the time of evil is coming. And we want to be out there warning, telling people not about viruses or what the latest, conspiracy theory is, and there's a bunch of them out there. Let me tell you, I've seen a lot. Who cares? Are there evil men? Yes. Are they doing evil things? Yes. Do I care? No. Why? Because God is sovereign. And what I want to tell people about is the choice that every man has to make. The opportunity before everyone to choose where they're going to spend their eternity, and there's only one decision they can make that will affect that, and it's what they do with Jesus Christ. Let's seize the time, recognize the days in which we live, and go out and tell people the hope that we have, the hope of heaven. Let's pray. Lord, we just thank you for this evening, Father, for what admittedly is an amazing passage. Lord, history in advance, who does that? Who details down to the minutia of who married who and who betrayed who and how they did it and who conquered where and why. Lord, the nuances that you put in this passage are really remarkable. But I have to think the reason they're there is not for us to be in awe of what took place, but Lord, that we might recognize and be stirred to see how accurate your word is, to give us confidence about what is coming and about to take place. Lord, if you were so accurate with the history that you gave to Daniel for a kingdom that was 2,000 years ago, how much more accurate can you be with what's about to take place in our time today? Well, let that stir our hearts. And let that get us excited. Oh, the days are evil. The time is short. Lord, but the message is powerful. We want to share it. Use this, we pray and ask. In Jesus' name we say, amen.